Welcome to Engadget Tomorrow. I'm Imran Sheikh, and this is where you get to hear about tomorrow today. Today, we're talking about a French bill allowing police to remotely activate phone cameras and microphones for surveillance, and the U.S. using robots to destroy the world's last known chemical weapons stockpile. Let's start off with what's happening in France. French law enforcement may soon have far-reaching authority to snoop on alleged criminals. Lawmakers in France's National Assembly have passed a bill that lets police surveil suspects by remotely activating cameras, microphones, and GPS location systems on phones and other devices. According to Le Monde, a judge will have to approve the use of the powers, and the recently amended bill forbids use against journalists, lawyers, and other sensitive professions. The measure is also meant to limit use to serious cases and only for a maximum of 6 months. For example, geolocation would be limited to crimes that are punishable by at least 5 years in prison. An earlier version of the bill passed the Senate, but the amendment will require that legislative body's approval before it can become law. Civil liberties advocates are alarmed. The digital rights group La Quadrature du Net already pointed out the potential for abuse. Since the bill isn't clear about what constitutes a serious crime, there are fears the French government might use this to target environmental activists and others who aren't actually grave threats. The organization also noted that worrying security policies like these have a habit of expanding to less serious crimes. For example, La Quadrature pointed out that genetic registration was only used for sex offenders at first, but is now being used for most crimes. The group also went on to note that remote access may depend on security vulnerabilities, and police would be exploiting security holes instead of telling manufacturers how to patch those holes. Justice Minister Éric Dupond-Moretti says the powers would only be used for dozens of cases per year, and that this was far away from the surveillance state of Orwell's 1984, arguing it will save lives. And this legislation comes as concerns about government device surveillance grow. There's been a backlash against NSO Group, whose Pegasus spyware has allegedly been misused to spy on dissidents, activists, and even politicians. While the French bill is more focused, it's not exactly reassuring to those worried about government overreach. On the other hand, according to the U.S. Army, we no longer have to worry about the world's governments getting into the chemical weapons business. The U.S. Army tells the New York Times it should finish destroying the world's last declared chemical weapons stockpile as of July 7th. The U.S. and most other nations agreed to completely eliminate their arsenals within 10 years after the Chemical Weapons Convention took effect in 1997. But the sheer size of the American collection, with many of the warheads being several decades old, and the complexity of safe disposal left the country running late. The current method relies on robots that puncture, drain, and wash the chemical-laden artillery shells and rockets, which are then baked to render them harmless. The drained gas is diluted in hot water and neutralized either with bacteria, for mustard gas, or caustic soda, for nerve agents. The remaining liquid is then incinerated. Teams use X-rays to check for leaks before destruction starts, and they remotely monitor robots to minimize contact with hazardous material. This wasn't the only plan for disposal. The Army initially wanted to dispose of the weapons by sinking them on ships, as it had quietly done before, but faced a public backlash over the potential environmental impact. Proposals to incinerate chemical agents in the 1980s also met with objections, although the military ultimately destroyed a large chunk of the stockpile that way. The U.S. last used chemical weapons in World War I, but kept producing them for decades as a deterrent. Attention to the program first spiked in 1968, when strange sheep deaths led to revelations that the Army was storing chemical weapons across the U.S. and even testing them in the open. To be clear, this measure will only wipe out confirmed stockpiles. Russia has been accused of secretly making nerve gas despite insisting that it destroyed its last chemical weapons in 2017. Pro-government Syrian military forces and ISIS extremists use the weapons throughout much of the 2010s. This won't stop hostile countries and terrorists from using the toxins. Even so, this is a major milestone. In addition to wiping out an entire category of weapons of mass destruction, it represents another step toward reduced lethality in war. Drones reduce the exposure for their operators, though not the targets, and experts like AI researcher Jeffrey Hinton envision an era when robots fight each other. While humanity would ideally end war altogether, efforts like these at least reduce the casualties. Thanks for listening to the show. Make sure to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. Today's show featured journalism by Engadget contributors John Fingus and was produced by Spoken Layer. I'm Imran Sheikh, and we'll talk more tomorrow.
Spoken Layer.